Now there is, as we understand it, there is going to be the last part of today's ceremony or ceremonies is going to be wreath laying and candles will be lit. So we're going to stay on the pictures here, on the images from the death gate at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp where the ceremony has been taking place, to see what comes next. It's been a particularly moving ceremony, I do have to say. We saw many tears yesterday, John. We saw many more today.
We did. I thought, particularly during the prayers for the dead, it was a very, very moving moment. There is, of course, an obligation for Jewish people, as indeed for Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, to pray for the dead. And the survivors coming here to Auschwitz, one of the reasons they do this in the commemoration is also to fulfill that religious obligation to pray for people who have no relatives to pray for them. That is a particularly poignant, I think, fact and aspect of these prayers said here today.
It is a very stark sight, this death gate. As I explained earlier, the last trains from in the latter years of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, this spur, this railway line, was actually specially designed to take the trains through the gate that you can see illuminated right in front of us. As we see here, another one of the survivors. There have been many here today, 300 it's estimated. 1,500 last time round. There was a major commemoration ceremony for the 60th anniversary 10 years ago. Just 300 this time. That's the reason why the survivors have been at the heart of today's ceremony, why we heard testimony from 3 survivors, very moving testimony. And as I say, it was through that gate there that the trains would enter. That was where the ramp was. Horrific scenes played out just beyond that gate. SS officers, often doctors, would point to the left or to the right. If you were sent to the left, often women and children not deemed strong enough to work in the slave labour camps that were part of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, they were led away to their deaths very quickly in most instances. Those who moved to the right were often used for slave labour, worked to death, died of hunger, died of illness. This is truly a horrific place. And it's been a very difficult ceremony for many of the survivors. That was what we saw. But it has been a very apt and appropriate commemoration ceremony. As I say, tinged with anger, I felt, on the part of Ronald Lauder, the head of the World Jewish Congress, talking about the rise of anti-Semitism, recent events in Paris. There was a very contemporary note to what we were seeing.
It is a strange paradox, perhaps, but of course in Berlin we have seen a real flourishing of the Jewish community.
Yes, and I mentioned that to Mr. Lauder when I spoke to him
Yes.
yesterday, and he was very encouraged by that. That was for him very much a positive note about the contemporary phase we find ourselves in. Remarkable images here, John. Night has now fallen during the ceremony. We're outside here in front of the tent where that ceremony has been taking place. It's dark. It's become a little bit colder still. We've had some quite strong snowfall in the last hour or so. And as I said, now there is going to be the wreath laying. This is the area of the camp that I was talking about.
With the ramp.
The ramp, where, as I said, hellish scenes were played out. Almost beyond imagination, really. There you can see the gate of death in the background.
Mr. Lauder speculating at the beginning of his speech today that at the time that he was born, of course, if he'd been born in Hungary, as his ancestors were, instead of in the United States, that he almost certainly would not have survived the Holocaust. He would have been, of course, a very young child, an infant, and as Elie Wiesel tells in his memoirs, infants, it seems, this is surely, Peter, one of the things that is incomprehensible cruelty, that infants were taken alive and thrown into the crematoria.
Indeed, and it's very important that you mentioned the Hungarian Jews, because towards the end, beginning in 1943, the Hungarian Jews were slaughtered. It's the only word to use, really. 800,000 Hungarian Jews met their death, at least as a result of the barbarity of the Nazis and the Germans, and well over 400,000 of them were brought here and murdered. You can see how cold and how dark it has become. It's a very somber atmosphere with the lighting, and where John and I are standing, the barracks behind us are illuminated in a way that is rather eerie and evocative, but still it's so difficult to comprehend. We've been told so much, we've had so much powerful testimony today, and this is why the survivors are so important, because they can tell us their stories directly.
That's right. I think one of the reasons, surely, Peter, is not only the enormity of the cruelty, the extraordinary cruelty involved, but the numbers involved, that an ordinary human being can't wrap his or her head around the millions of people involved who were slaughtered in this barbaric way. It's when, for me at least, yesterday, and I think you were saying something very similar, it's when you go to the museum here and see individual items associated with individual people that it becomes somewhat more tangible, somewhat more possible to imagine, just slightly more possible. That moment when we stopped yesterday in front of that huge pile of suitcases which people had packed and written their names on, bringing them.
Do continue, John.
Yes, there's suitcases, this huge pile of suitcases, abandoned suitcases, because the Nazis, of course, emptied their suitcases cynically and plundered the meager possessions of these people whom they then proceeded to murder. But there was one suitcase there with a young girl's name on it, and it said orphan, describing her as orphan, her name, and she was, according to the dates on the suitcase, just 8 years old. And suddenly it becomes, in that moment, of course, because it's a personal, individual story, that somehow one can see in one's mind's eye that 8-year-old orphan arriving in Auschwitz, and suddenly, to some little extent perhaps, one is able to grasp some of the immense, incomprehensible horror.
And when you talk about the immense, incomparable horror, we have been hearing contemporary references to the rise in anti-Semitism in many parts of Europe at this point in time. I was just wondering, John, what your thoughts are about something that we began this broadcast with a couple of hours ago, thoughts about what all of this has got to do with contemporary Germany.
That's a difficult question, isn't it? I think Germany, the Germany that you and I live in, is of course a very, very different Germany from the Germany of 70 years ago. And I think part of the difficulties, it's part of the problems in communicating the horrors of the Nazi era to young people today in Germany, which is a problem that concerns educationalists, politicians and others, because it seems to them, like to young people, that it's just ancient history, and why should one be concerned with it any more than with the Napoleonic wars or other old things in history. I think that this is also has a positive aspect. It's because Germany has really changed a great deal. That it is a country in which any public figure, for example, who breathed even the slightest anti-Semitic remark would be pounced upon in the media and possibly have their career ruined by that, and rightly so. It's something that modern German society is very sensitive about, rightly so.
Indeed.
But it remains a problem, of course, to communicate, and Germany has a special responsibility to do so, to communicate this horror that is part of German history. And that must be kept alive.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for those comments. We're going to go back now from Auschwitz-Birkenau, from the death camp here, where today's ceremony marking the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. We're going to go back to our studio in Berlin.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. The wreath-laying ceremony, as you could see there, a moving day, especially for the survivors gathered in Auschwitz. They've made the trip back for us so that we don't forget what happened. Thank you to Peter and John.